So just came back from a walk and I was thinking about something that a friend had told me. He told me that he wanted to start a church. And I thought that was particularly interesting in 2020 because churches are fundamentally changing. Church used to be going into a physical building and it just isn't anymore. And so it begs the question, what does building a church in 2020 even look like? I think in order to understand that, we have to take a look at what churches have looked like in the past, and it might help us give some sort of have some sort of insight into what it might look like in the future, for example. So I always ask the question when someone says that they want to start something, I always ask the question why. It helps me understand the likelihood of success, right? If I ask why and that person's able to talk about their core motivations, they're able to talk about the market that they're in, they're able to talk about the people that they'll ultimately serve, I have a pretty good indication of whether they'll be successful or not, right? And so we ask the question why to understand how likely something is to succeed. Well, in this case, I didn't ask the question why, and I think it was because I'd seen some research that I felt was particularly interesting, and I wanted to share it with him. So I looked at all of the churches that would be considered mega churches by today's standards. So it's all churches that have more than 2,000 weekly members or attendees, maybe. And it paints a very interesting picture when you start to look at the churches and their weekly attendance and then go online and start to look at their online reach because it really tells a lot about their perspective, right? So, a church that has a very large in person gathering, but has a fairly small, comparatively, very small online reach, you have a picture of what that church's focus is and where their resources are directed. So I took a look at two churches in particular that paint a particularly interesting picture of what those two perspectives might look like. Church A is a 45,000 person per weekend service. It's massive. Church B is a 15,000 person per weekend service. Also massive, but fairly small compared to Church A. So when we look at these two churches and then we introduce their online presence, we get a little bit of a picture as to what the future of churches might look like. Church A has 49,000 people following them on social media. So 45,000 people attend, 49,000 people online. Church B has 15,000 people weekly and 3.6 million people online. And so we have the tale of two very different perspectives. One would be considered small compared to the other, but it has a reach that's far greater than the other. And so when we look at going online, I think one of the things that we have to look at is, what does the future of the church look like? How do we go about reaching people? And since we know that reaching people is no longer getting 45,000 or 15,000 people into a building, we have to transfer that perspective and say, hey, what does it look like to reach people online, and how many people is a lot of people to reach online? 15,000 people, whether you reach them in a physical building or you reach them online, is still 15,000 people. But even as I say that, if you think about 15,000 people being reached in a single building or in across multiple locations, you're thinking about a lot of people. You're imagining a lot of people. When I say that someone has 15,000 followers on Instagram, perhaps, doesn't feel like a ton of people, but it's still 15,000. So if someone's starting a church in 2020, perhaps, or 2022, I wonder if having a mega church would look more like having 30, 40, 60,000 people that are following you on social media. 60,000 people would be the largest church that we have in America right now. 60,000 people online, not so much. So perhaps in 2020 and going forward, we're going to fundamentally rethink what having a megachurch even looks like. And so maybe that's why I didn't want to bring in the question of why, or ask, essentially, what's the likelihood of you being successful, my friend? Because honestly, I think the fundamental perspective or definition of success is changing. If 15,000 people, which is a wildly successful church, is a success in the physical world, perhaps 15,000 people in the digital world will also be the new megachurch.